Okay.
So that was the ultimate impetus for getting healthier. But that day to day, man, is it's not about the mirror, but it's just about how I felt. I didn't like the way my clothes fit. I didn't like the way I felt like I was kind of trapped a little bit in a body that was not as capable as it used to be with
Hmm.
sports and just taking my kids to the swimming pool when they were young. Like I would get uncomfortable because I was overweight and I didn't feel well and I didn't like the way I
Right.
looked. And on top of that, um, you know, having to disconnect an insulin pump when I went in the pool would mean that you're then you're making a deal with the devil for your blood sugar to go up to spend time with your kids in the pool
That's
or
right.
all
That's
that.
right.
So anyway, um, the diet changed all that for me, and the exercise, zone 2 exercise, changed all that for me. So I started out 240 pounds in December of 2018. That was kind of the highest it was.
Hi, guys. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. This is part two of a previous episode where we talked a little bit about diabetes type 1 and for those with type 2 who are insulin dependent. And I was really having such a great time with my guest that I decided to make it a part one and a part two. And I really appreciate him being gracious to spend some more time with us today. And I want to do a shout out to his family, his wife in particular, for allowing you to be with us. So thank you. But let me just introduce him so that you'll know who he is if you didn't see part one or check that out. And he's a patient of mine, and he's been living with type 1 diabetes for 27 years. And it's been his journey to deal with that that's brought him to this episode and just an opportunity for him to help us. His name is Mike Paparonis, and he's also been married for about 17 years, been a teacher. He's a great teacher for 20 years. He has two great kids, and I just wanted him to continue to share why he feels that low carb and keto has saved his life. So thanks again, buddy, for coming to part two of your podcast interview.
Oh, thanks for having me back. It's great to be here, and it's
Yep.
so much fun talking to you about this. So
Oh yeah, it's a. I wish we had more time in clinic, right? But we have to. So since the health system won't allow, we'll
that's
do
it.
it this way. So we talked a lot about some concepts. What's your diet routine? We talked about in the previous episode, why low carb versus keto versus carnivore, how this diagnosis has affected you emotionally, uh, you know, how you found these diets in the first place, what it felt like to be diagnosed with a condition that requires to stick yourself. You became a human pincushion, for lack of better words. Thank God for continuous glucose monitors, which is why we're going to definitely touch on that a little bit. But the average person, um, you know, on insulin, because of the current conventional model, which says eat all the carbs you want, just match it with the insulin. And if you don't match it right, you're going to be too high or too low.
Which
And
is
if
every
you,
time.
which is every time, right? Hey, I like that. And because it's so often, there are going to be times when the extremes occur. My sugars are way too high or they're way too low. And next thing you know, you find yourself in a hospital.
Mhm.
So, what have you done to make sure that you're not the guy, that Mike's not going to be in the hospital?
So it's a great question. I think I tend to be an anxious person. I know I do actually. So I
Mhm.
think part of that has been almost like a defense mechanism for me where
Mm.
I'm very careful about it. But as you said, no matter how careful you are, following traditional dietary advice for type 1 diabetes in the United States, you're going to end up high or low. It's going to
That's
happen.
right.
And so I think, to be totally honest, um, when I was in college, I made some really poor choices dietarily
Mhm.
and with alcohol consumption and things like that, as college kids tend to do. But um, I didn't understand enough about how my metabolism worked. Again, I think last time we talked about, I didn't understand what insulin did. Like I
Mhm.
understand that it
Right.
brought my numbers down, but I didn't understand how, the path by which it actually processes things in the body. And so, when you don't understand those things, and it's not my doctor's fault, as we talked about, it's as a 17, 18, 19, 20 year old, you're just trying to get by and get your degree done and get your get your friend, social engagements, things like that.
That's right.
I wouldn't have even, if had they offered, I wouldn't have had time to actually stop and understand how it works.
That's
So
right.
they just say, you're like everybody else, you just have to take insulin. Well, when you approach, social situations, especially in college and especially when you're young, with that mindset, it's like, oh, well, everybody else is having 6, 7 beers.
Mhm.
I can do that. And you would have never gotten me to eat 7 pieces of bread. You would have never gotten me to do, um, without taking insulin for it or whatever. So that roller coaster, especially in those social situations, was bad and it was dangerous. I mean, I can tell you there were times when I probably should have, I was tap dancing on that line for
Right.
hospitals, whatever. I can remember times, my blood sugar would drop into the 30s. The lowest I've ever been was 21. And I woke up and I was like, oh man, but we'd been out having a couple of drinks and blah, blah, blah.
That's right.
And thank goodness that for whatever reason, I was able to treat that, stayed out. So I won't pretend that I've been perfect, but I have not had to be hospitalized since my original diagnosis. And now, luckily, things are so much better that I think what I credit to it is just, I mean, number one, this diet, I don't even worry about it anymore because of the way I eat.
Right.
Um, I didn't realize that folks end up in the hospital more, uh,
Right.
like I was talking to a fellow type 1 and she was telling me, oh yeah, I've had to use my glucagon or my Gvoke here and there,
Mhm.
and I've never had, knock on wood, I've never had to. I still certainly keep it next to the bed because, just for emergencies, but have never really had to do it. And I do credit nowadays, after college, that was probably the roughest part. I met my wife soon after that. And my wife's approach to everything was very much, hey, you should self-advocate. Again, she had
Mhm.
uh, several type 2s and what I think may have been a type 1 in her family, but it was just misdiagnosed back up in the day. Um, but she was always very much about, no, ask for what you need. And
That's right.
also, yes, if you're in a social situation and everybody is doing A, that doesn't mean you can't do B and stay
That's right.
healthy. And
That's right.
so
That's right.
that message was very powerful for me. And then, of course, my kids coming around, it's the stakes are much higher. So finding low carb made it so that I don't worry about those swings anymore. Dr. Bernstein talks about them in his book where
Mhm.
you don't want to use a sledgehammer on a thumbtack. Like lower amounts of carbohydrate mean lower amounts of insulin, which means not only are you more sensitive to both, so you can correct a little more easily,
That's right.
but you're also just not going to have those swings because if you mess up a little bit, which we do, we're humans. If you're off in your calculations a little bit, we're talking fractions of units of insulin.
That's
Instead,
right.
if I used to bolus for meals, uh, you know, I would take 5, 6 units of regular. If I took 5 or
Mhm.
6 units of regular in an injection right now, I would just drive immediately to the hospital because I'm going to pass out. Like this is, we're talking about corrections now of fractions of a
That's
decimal.
crazy.
Um, and yeah, so that takes away a huge risk. And I would say if there is a secret, quote unquote, to staying out of the hospital, it's that. It's just, I heard it. I wish I remembered who said this because it was so great. Somebody in the low carb space who was a type 1 was saying,
Mhm.
you know, if you look at it as sugar is the poison to a type 1 diabetic,
Right.
insulin is the antidote. There's never a time when we would tell someone, just keep eating more of the poison and just take more antidote. You'll
That's
be
right.
fine.
That's
We
right.
would advise them, hey, if something is poisoning you, let's try to remove as much of that as possible
That's
from
right.
the situation. And I'll think of who said that later. I certainly
Well, let
can't
me
think
tell
of
you, I don't know who said it when you heard it, but I've definitely said it
it. Have you? Okay.
because Imma tell you, man,
It might have
in
been you.
fact, I was actually gonna, make a video where and I almost recorded it this week for my YouTube channel,
Mhm.
and I was literally gonna, walk into the clinic, office where we see patients and say, "Okay, in this room is a snake, you know, and we have a choice when we see a snake. We can feel comfortable being around the snake because we have a shot we can take as an antidote, or we can get the hell out of that room."
That's it. You know what? Not the person I'm thinking of. It might have been you that told me that.
So I am 100% a fan of saying to my audience and to anybody who will hear us away from the poison. And so and it doesn't mean you can't have some carbs. Obviously, sometimes keto allows you to eat carbs, but we certainly are not going to eat the ones that are acting like that snake. And so I really love the fact that you've normalized not going to the hospital. You've
Yeah,
normalized not having to worry about this glucagon shot, which you'll have just in case anyway. You've
sure.
normalized not having to have hyperglycemia every week, having hypoglycemia every week. And you remind me of a previous guest, you may have heard him, Dr. Keith Runyon. And he is a nephrologist. And for those who haven't checked out that episode, please do. But he's a nephrologist with type 1 diabetes. And he said that if I have a low sugar once or twice a year, that's about it.
That's
Because
outstanding.
it just makes sense. Because if you're eating something, and when people with type 1 diabetes hear you say, if you take 4 or 5 units, that's going to send you to the hospital, they think you're nuts. But that's
Yep.
what happens when you stop eating the poison.
Yep.
Right? So I just love
Gosh.
that, and not to mention, so this is just one. This is the most important lever you can pull, other than having insulin, if you have to take insulin for type 1. But then, what about your? Were you exercising that day? If you know, are you dehydrated for some reason? Are you ill? Did you get an illness that affects your blood sugar? Are you under a lot of stress? Are you about to have surgery? Are you having particularly for our ladies, are you having some hormone issues? All of these factors will determine whether or not you have a normal blood sugar. And so the last thing you need is to go get some Cheerios with 28 carbs on a label, which may or may not be 28 carbs, depending on how much you put in your bowl. And you're trying to guess. I mean, who measures it? And even if you measure it, it's a guessing game, and they're allowed to be off by 20%. So is it 28 or is it 24 or is it 32? So it's a disaster for a clinician or anybody in this space to think that that's a better model than to just get rid of the poison. So
You're giving me flashbacks of carb exchanges, man. In the 90s, it was, I can tell you off, it will never, I will go to my grave thinking about, oh, a serving of cereal is 3/4 of a cup, because those were starch exchanges, as we called them back in the day.
that's right. That's
And
right.
had you told me in 1997, forget about all that. Like, you don't even, like,
Right.
yes, that's, if you're going to eat carbs, you may need to think about it that way. But in the meantime, if we just remove that from the equation and you can eat these other things, what a powerful tool that would have been to a 15-year-old,
Yes.
16-year-old, 17-year-old me.
Yes. And speaking of tools, how blessed are we that somebody, that's why, see, this is the thing, guys. I am not anti-medicine. I am not anti-technology. All of these things are helpful. In fact, I don't know if it was when I saw you last, but in clinic. But we're converting from a model where our notes are recorded, and then a doctor writes it. In our case, it was doctors in India, because they have so many doctors in India that they literally have to have something other than being in front of patients to kind of make sure they have work. And now we're going to AI. So now I walk in the room with my phone. We just started about a week or two
Yeah.
before the recording, and the computer will write the notes within 30 seconds of us finish our conversation. It's crazy. So I love technology,
Yep.
and my wife needs insulin. You need insulin. I'm glad, like you said in the previous episode. So God, thankful they invented that, right?
Yep.
Now, having said that, this continuous glucose monitor. When did you start using that, and how did that change your life?
So I was very resistant to going on a pump. Again, I went all through college doing multiple daily injections.
Right.
I would say, my wife and I started dating, and it was out of pure vanity. I didn't want to be the weird guy with the
Right.
tube attached to me, especially on
Yeah.
the dating scene and things like that. Right. I should have. My wife wouldn't have cared, and she didn't end up caring. But I didn't go with a pump until I was probably, I was probably 30. So, and I'm
Mhm.
42 now. So I've been on a pump for about the last 12 years. Started with Medtronic on their 530, which was the one that just looked like a clear plastic pager. And it
Yes.
just had a little liquid crystal display.
Yeah.
There was no CGM. It was, you did a whole bunch of kind of experimenting,
That's
which is
right.
always funny because everyone was fine with experimenting with my diet in that way, but
Mhm.
not necessarily when I started experimenting, but with low carb. But you experimented and you found different basal rates that worked better for you at different times of the day. So basically, between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., I need 0.85 units per hour. And then at 10 o'clock, to 1 o'clock is a stressful time at work for me. So I need a little bit more. And I did that. And then when I switched over to, it would have been one of the other, it was it would have been one of the other Medtronic pumps, and they had
Mhm.
their continuous glucose monitor. And my
That's right.
endocrinologist at the time recommended it. He's since retired. Shout out to Dr. Philip Werner back in the day up there at
Absolutely.
Lutheran General. His pump nurse is the one pump nurse that I've ever had that is wonderful and gets it. And
Mhm.
she herself is type 1. I felt so lucky to have a pump nurse who's type 1. I've recently, since I started seeing you about a year ago, I've gone back to that office, and I thought she
Okay.
retired with Dr.
And
Werner.
she's still there.
Last week, I was, oh my gosh, Carol Bailey is her name, and she worked with
Okay,
Advocate, and
Carol.
she's just
Okay.
outstanding. Um, and I saw her when I was waiting to see my endo, and I was like, "You're still here?" And she said, and she joked, she said, "Yeah, why do you think I look like I should retire?" And I was like, "No, no, 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 no." But I have an appointment to see her coming up here in about 3 days, so I'm so excited to get back to her.
Nice.
But she was the one who turned me on to the CGM, and she said, "Look, this is what it does." I didn't fully understand what that meant in
Mhm.
terms of security and feeling good about um, overnights and things like that. But also that's because they weren't looping yet at that point. It was your CGM will tell you what your blood sugar is, and then you can make adjustments on your pump accordingly. But they weren't talking
Okay.
to each other yet. And
Right.
if anyone is out there and they're unfamiliar with it or hesitant about it, basically what happens now is the CGM, and Doc, correct me if I'm wrong, but the CGM measures the glucose in your interstitial fluid. So not true blood
Mhm.
glucose, but
Right, no question.
my experience with the Dexcom that I'm on now is that there is no difference. I can prick my finger and
That's
it's within 2
sweet.
points
That's
of
sweet.
and low carb helps that because the steadier you keep it, the better the
That's
job
right.
that glucose
That's
monitor.
right.
But it will then tell the pump here's what my blood sugar is trending, and the pump will make small adjustments accordingly. For
Mhm.
me, the biggest benefit of that, trending up, I can feel it. I can feel high blood sugar, and you can adjust it. And it's while you don't want that, it's not nearly as urgent as a falling blood
Mhm.
sugar in the short term, anyway. And so it will, when my blood sugar is going down, the biggest benefit I get is that uh, it turns off the pump. It turns
Mhm.
off. I put in air quotes because it will adjust your insulin level, insulin delivery. And rather than having to go straight to glucose tablets, let's remove some of the insulin and see if your body's sugar
Mhm.
will naturally come up. Uh,
Okay.
and that in and of itself is so
Oh,
just
yeah.
the emotional and psychological part of that, of going to bed knowing that even if I messed up a little bit,
That's right.
A, it's going to fix it. Like
That's
I
right.
used, or B, it's going to tell me. So when I first went on it, the biggest impression I had that I would tell my wife and then I told other people is that when I was on an insulin pump before and it wasn't looping, the
Mhm.
CGM would tell me when I was going low and I could
Mhm.
fix it.
That's right.
When it started looping, I never knew because I didn't go low because it got out ahead of
Mm.
it and took care of it before it ever. So
That's
I
right.
used to love that the CGM would wake me up in the middle of the night so I could
That's
fix it
right.
low. Then I realized, oh, the new one doesn't wake me up because it never actually happens.
That's right. It
And
never
that to me
happens.
was so life changing. And
We
so
see this
I'm with
often
you
with
on
my wife,
medicine.
man.
I
My
love to.
wife has the same. I mean, there's so many days when we've like when she's not like looking at the monitor because she's using this technology as well, and like the pump just stopped.
Yep.
It just stops, and you're like, "Oh, that's nice." So,
Yep.
and this is the funny part, they're still advancing this technology. So, but what we don't want to do is, as the technology advances, still put in our brain that, "Oh, this artificial pancreas," because it'll get to a point where it's functioning like a pancreas. We're still don't just like we don't wanna stress our natural pancreas, if we come up with technology that can do a better job, and that's gonna continue to evolve, why would we wanna stress out the technology? Why would we wanna then say, "Oh, I can just eat 300 carbs, it's just gonna give me enough insulin?" And I think the bigger message is too much insulin in general can lead to other issues. Insulin too high can cause your blood vessels to constrict. Too much insulin will make you hold on to more water and salt. Too much insulin can cause inflammation. So even if we have the perfect technology, why would we want to pump all of this exogenous coming from outside your body insulin into our body that will then maybe control our sugars better than without it, obviously. But then we have all these other downstream consequences. So it just doesn't make sense.
Totally. And as a person, and we can talk a little in a while, I'm also a migraine sufferer. And I didn't know until you just said that, I didn't realize that insulin, when my blood sugar is steady, my migraines are better. And
Right.
was it Dr. Ovadian's wife, I think, was saying that the minute she starts with carbs, the migraines start.
That's right.
Um, and, if that insulin, if I'm taking a lot of insulin to cover a lot of carbs I'm eating and my blood vessels are constricting, it's when they relax and they over relax is when those migraines start for me anyway. And so that's something that obviously it just affects so many different facets of
Yeah. These are the things that we don't talk about as much, but it's a list of. I'll have a future guest that I met on the low carb cruise who was kind of my table mate, and he had like I think 2 pages of stuff that got better when he started doing keto,
Mhm.
and honestly, it was those little things. Oh man, he was used to, maybe headaches were one of those things. Maybe it was
Yep.
heartburn. But guys, uh,
Knee pain. My knee
keto,
pain went away. I was in
I
physical
know,
therapy.
like
I started eating low carb and I was like,
right.
oh, my knee is fine.
It's crazy, and we just want to feel good. So let's talk a little bit about um, for you what's been normal. So when you think about the good thing about this technology is that it'll let you know what your average blood sugars are,
Yep.
and it'll give you a sense of that. So do you have a sense of what percentage of the time your blood sugars are in what we call the normal range?
Yeah. So it depends who you ask in terms of the technology. I have two
Yeah.
apps that are connected to my Omnipod 5. And again, the Omnipod 5 I couldn't be happier with.
Mhm.
The Dexcom making that switch tubeless as a pump without a tube. It's all the insulin is just held in the pump itself. Makes me feel like a quote unquote normal person a little bit more. It's
Right.
wonderful.
Whatever that
But they
means.
use two apps. One of the apps that I use to share with my provider is called Gluco, so they can see all of the averages of what my readings are.
Okay.
And Gluco, the way at least it's set up, I'm not sure if I have control over it. I have to look at it, but it basically counts 80 to 180 as target range.
Cool.
And so for me, that I don't want to be anywhere near that
Right.
180.
Not at the
But
top of that. No.
but if you ask that app, I'm 99% of the time I'm in range.
Right.
And
Right.
I happen to
Okay.
know just based on my day to day that that's not totally accurate. I'm not
That's right.
99% of the time.
That's right.
So I try to, I shoot, I think in the other app, the Dexcom, uh, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but Clarity, that's what it's called.
Okay.
I shoot for around 115, 110, 120.
Okay.
And there currently I'm about 60% in range
Okay.
on stretches of great. And this is where I think I need to investigate more with carnivore.
That's right.
The only reason it's only, or at least ketovore, the only reason it's 60% and not up in those 80s and 90% is user error. It's things I'm eating. I'm a human. And so there's times when I say, oh, I could do that. Oh, I could get away with that.
That's
Or
right.
just
That's right.
overeating and misjudging insulin or hormones or stress. I've got two teenagers. There's stress. There's,
Man.
yeah. And so those things are, so it's not there yet.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that yet is even in that sentence is a testament to low carb, because before low carb, I was told by every doctor until I started working with you, I was told by every doctor, you're never going to have an A1C under 6 or you're going to be passing out on the floor.
Right. That's right. That's the
And if
belief.
you are eating a carbohydrate rich diet, I have no doubt that that's the case. No doubt. But with a low carb diet, if you go into some of the online forums that are people that are type 1, keto for type 1, things like that, there's a particular subreddit called Keto for Type 1 that you can find all the people you want in there that are at 5'6", 5'7". And so that's really my ultimate goal.
Yeah.
And food and me tweaking my diet is what's going to get me there. And so
Yeah.
that's what I shoot for.
Well, I'm glad you commented on the standard,
Mm-hmm.
and the app said 80 to 180,
Yeah.
and
That's not a standard to
that's
me.
not a
It
good
was back in
standard,
the
right?
day, but once you start fine tuning things, that
Yeah,
goes
that's
out
just
the window.
ridiculous. And
Yeah.
the reality is, if you take people who stay even at the goal that the American Diabetes Association says, which is a 7, you're still going to lose years of life. If
Correct.
you're
And
higher, if
that's a
the
deal
average
breaker.
A1C is, it's like you're still in. If
Yep.
you're at 8.5 or 8.6, you may lose 10 to 12 years. If you're at 10 to 12, you're going to lose even more years of life. So we don't
Yep.
want to lose years of life because those teenagers who you love so much. A shout
That's
out
it.
to this. What's their ages, by the way?
My
I mean,
daughter is 15 and my son is 14.
what's their names?
Vivian is my daughter and Daniel is my son.
So I'm so jealous. I got two boys. I love both of them, but I tried to get a girl, but that's God. So we'll work with that. But I really appreciate this conversation because you were told by the people who we entrust our care to that you can't have a A1C less than 6 because you're at risk for hypoglycemia. And the reason why you would have been at risk for hypoglycemia is because you're chasing this these carbs with
Yep.
insulin and you just didn't guess right how much you needed. But if we take in a meal that's got 2 or 3 or 4 carbs or 0 carbs, well, we can't, it's hard to make a mistake on that because I won't need as much insulin. I do have to think about the protein, and that's another thing that they're not doing in the endocrine community is that they're not thinking about protein, but any graph of protein, fat, carbs will show you that protein can spike the blood sugar a little bit. So you
Yep.
need to think about that when you're managing it. But I
Totally.
do want to say out loud, and I'll have a link to the study that was done by the wonderful Dr. Eric Westman was in the study. David Dykman, who has a teenager, now young adult, who he really engaged. David Lutwick and others. But the bottom line is called Management of Type 1 Diabetes with a Very Low Carb Diet. And in that study, because they understand what we're talking about, they got the carb intake to 36 or less for the that was the group. These are people who were part of the Type 1 Grit Facebook group, so make sure you check that out as well. And with their blood sugars averaging or carbs averaging 36, the average A1C in this group of 316 participants in the study was 5.6.
Amazing.
So and they're not having these hypoglycemias and hyperglycemia. So if we got 316 random people in type 1 grid showing that that's possible, if it's possible for them, it's possible for you. So for anybody out there checking us out, please check out Type 1 Grit Diabetes Group. Check out Dr. Bernstein's book. I mentioned in the previous episode, Dr. Keith Runyon. He has a Type 1 book you can find on Amazon, and he's doing a great job. Dr. Rashani Sanghani, she's a previous guest, and she is in India helping people with type 2 and type 1, and she has an entire chapter talking about type 1. In fact, it may be, when you think about what's easy to read, Dr. Bernstein's, he's harder to read, and you have to be a teacher to kind of digest it. I'm so glad you're a teacher. Dr. Runyon is a level below that, where it's a little bit easier to understand. And I'm going to try to have a link to all these books. And Dr. Rashani Sanghani, her book is the 5th grade level.
Yep.
So the whole book's not about type 1, but it does provide, and she understood I have to have a path for type 1, and asterisk to this conversation. She's in India. Guess what? A lot of people in India are plant-based. So she's managed to figure out how to help people with plant-based diets to do this. Wonderful. Because we have to honor people and meet them where they are. I will never stand before you as a carnivore, as a proponent of low carb and keto, and say you can't, be plant-based. If you have to do that, there's a path, but you can't eat the foods that are going to spike your sugar. So you got me fired up, man.
No, totally. And I would add to that list even for that accessible, what helped me understand finally exactly what goes on when you put food in your mouth, when insulin gets secreted, is a lot of the stuff that Gary Taubes is writing, just because he's a journalist, and Nina Teicholz too.
Right. That's right.
They're so accessible because they write from a journalistic standpoint. Right. That I just think it's, I recommend, is it Good Calories, Bad Calories? Or
that's right. That was definitely Gary
written
Taubes.
A diabetes book as well.
Yeah.
Gary Taubes.
And then Nisha Teicholz was the Big Fat Surprise.
Those things were eye-opening for me. And I recommend those to people who want to get started on that journey.
And it removes the fear, because the Big Fat Surprise is that you don't have to worry about saturated fat. And if your doctor is still worried about total cholesterol, I mean, I literally had a doctor that I saw on YouTube I actually reviewed the Steak and Butter gal's, Bella, her labs, right? And so there was another doctor whose name eludes me right now, who was saying how ridiculously dangerous her labs were. So you'll have these experts out there who will, and he's a heart doctor, a cardiologist. He should be, a guy that gets it. And I get that, I honor him. I honor that his training. But to say that he said the HDL doesn't matter, that so-called good cholesterol, he said it doesn't matter. He said he said the LDL is the only thing that matters. And I think that way of thinking is false. And I think it's been debunked already. We know LDL and total cholesterol are poor predictors of heart disease. We know that the fasting insulin is 6.7 times more predictive. We know your blood pressure is twice as predictive as your LDL and your. So if we know these things, and then we have our peers who make statements that doesn't seem to align with the science, it really bothers me. So again, that's why it's so confusing. Because if you went down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out how to heal, and you found us, then you're down that rabbit hole. But then if you're on the other side, and you're like, well, who do you trust, right? And I would say, trust the evidence. The evidence is very clear, just like the study I'm going to share, that this works. And there's no, and these are, now this study was more observational because we just, kind of took some folks, they didn't do a randomized controlled trial, but we have plenty of randomized controlled trials that make it very clear low carb is the best diet for obesity. Is certainly, even the U.S. News and World Report said that for fast weight loss, it was keto. So it's the number one diet. So we already know it works, guys. Now, having said that, let's talk some more about your goals. Like, so your A1C, we're all evolving, and we're trying to get to 5.6 or lower. But how are you feeling about the A1C number, and what are your personal goals?
So my personal goal is to get under 6, under 5.9, under 5.7. It's sort of a game where it's like, not a game, but you have to look at it with a little bit of lightheartedness, where I love walking into a doctor's office and having them be kind of surprised that you're diabetic. How are you doing this?
Right.
I mean, so you don't have that question because you're familiar, but
right.
kind of shocking my endocrinologist, who's great, but just having her go, and we can talk about those statins and the conversations I've had to have with endocrinologists about statins, where while I'm healthy, when I'm healthy, because of the way I'm eating, I've learned, low carb has taught me that, normalcy, what we call normal, is possible.
That's
and
right.
so my goals, that means that for the first time in my life, my A1C goals are, I want to be 5.7 or lower. I want to be 5.6 or lower. And I want, from a blood test, you shouldn't be able to tell I'm diabetic unless you're looking for the actual, markers of type 1 diabetes.
C-peptide or something like that. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And so that's where my goal is. Last A1C was a couple of weeks ago. And I would say the last 3 months I've been struggling a little bit. Again, I'm a human, right?
That's right.
So I want to say it was around 6.5, something like that.
Yeah, it was. I think it was like 6.3 or something. But it was right in that range.
It's funny because 10 years ago I would have been like, "Oh man, I'm doing the best ever," and then I'm glad. But at the same time, I'm not about to give up and say good is good enough, because as you said, even at that A1C, losing 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is at end of life,
we don't want nothing.
No. So, it's just nice. I feel like low carb gives me the tools to be able to say that's unacceptable, but I want that. And I'm going to shoot for that. And so, that's where my goals are right now for my A1C. So I'm hoping in the next, ideally 3 months, but 3 to 6 months, I would love to see that number certainly drop below 6%.
And all the resources we mentioned previously, for those who are checking this out, if you just happen to be type 1, and if you're type 2, listen, we don't agree that the goal for the A1C should be 7.0. And again, the American Diabetes Association, these are just regular people like you and me. They're just doing, the work of God and the universe. But if your average A1C is 7.0, that means your average blood sugar is 150. And that's still not normal. And if it's not normal, it takes longer for the negative effects of blood sugar being elevated, glycation, and these other things to occur, but it's still not normal. So we want you guys to live in a world where normal is normal for everybody and for us. And again, you can, micromanage these numbers. They're just numbers, but technically we want 5.6 or lower, but anything less than where you are, if you're not at goal, is where we want you to be. You've also had success with your weight. Talk a little bit about what that success looked like, how much weight you've lost, and how long did it take you to do it?
So that, I mean, that's the thing where, obviously my blood sugar is the number one priority, but
That's right.
vanity is a great motivator, man. And I was never an overweight guy when I was younger. And youth allowed me to get away with it. In my 20s, I
Mhm.
was, 100, I'm about 6'2". I was about 170, 180 pounds. And then over the next decade or so of my 30s, I shot up to like 240. And I know, I
Mm.
mean, I used to commute every day from St. Charles to Wilmette, and so I could have told you
Mm.
where every McDonald's was. My kids were young.
Ah,
I was stressed. I could have taken you on a fast food tour of the
wow.
Western to North Shore suburbs. So, um, but so that was a great motivator too. It wasn't just that experience with my endocrinologist where I was approaching type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
But so that was the ultimate impetus for getting healthier. But that day to day, man, is it's not about the mirror, but it's just about how I felt. I didn't like the way my clothes fit. I didn't like the way I felt like I was kind of trapped a little bit in a body that was not as capable as it used to be with
Mhm.
sports and just taking my kids to the swimming pool when they were young. Like I would get uncomfortable because I was overweight and I didn't feel well and I didn't like the way I
Right.
looked. And on top of that, um, you know, having to disconnect an insulin pump when I went in the pool would mean that you're making a deal with the devil for your blood sugar to go up to spend time with your kids in the pool,
That's
or
right.
all
That's
that.
right.
So anyway, um, the diet changed all that for me, and the exercise, zone two exercise, changed all that for me. So I started out 240 pounds in December of 2018. That was kind of the highest it was,
Mhm.
um, or maybe shortly before that. And by March or April, I was down to about 185, 190. And then after that, I think the lowest I went was about 175, 180. But it,
That's
it
right.
happened in a
That's
matter of
right.
3 to 4 months. I mean, that weight just fell off.
3 to 4 months. That's
Crazy.
like
Yeah. And I know that that's
65
probably
pounds.
faster. I think I just happened to have that, whatever was with my metabolism made it happen quickly. So I certainly don't want people to compare, whatever is working for you is working for
That's
you.
right. I
And
agree.
and that's great. And now it's funny because I don't lose it as quickly. I think um, you know, I, I feel my most comfortable around 175, 180
Okay.
pounds.
Okay.
And I'm sitting today at probably 185, 190. So
That's right. That's
um,
right.
a little bit of fluctuation, a little room for improvement. I think that's where if I get rid of that dairy, I think that extra fat from the
Yeah.
dairy is going to help.
Yeah,
But
that
but yeah,
yeah.
it really was significant. It was a quick drop, but I felt great. That's the thing. People were
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, it's not healthy to lose weight that quickly." It's not that I was purposely doing it. I was just giving my body the fuel that it needed, and it felt like my body was going, "Oh my gosh, this is a refreshing, like we're finally getting the fuel we need."
Yeah.
And so yeah, it fell right off. It
And
really did.
I'm glad you brought up, dairy again. We kinda mentioned dairy, and you talked about, its potential to be addictive, and that was something you're worried about. And the answer to that is yes, it is. That protein in dairy called casein is definitely, broken down into, what they call casomorphins, believe it or not. So when they digest them, it's broken down into a chemical
Yeah,
called
that word morphine
casomorphin.
is right in there, right?
Exactly. So it's similar to the opioids, and it can attach to the same receptors in the brain. And yes, that makes it addictive. So for those who have the risk of that, so that's kind of one part of it. And then you got to just be careful with dairy in general. For some people, they just don't tolerate it anyway. Obviously, if it's fermented, we tolerate it. Yogurts and kefirs. So I
Yep.
think you just have to. Some people do better with raw dairy, but at the end of the day, this is an experiment. We mentioned that previously. Do the experiment, listen to your body, and do what it needs. And I really think that's going to always be important. And I think about, actually, I don't know if I told you previously, but I actually lived in Carroll Stream.
Mhm.
And for those who are checking us out, these are just western suburbs of Chicago. uh, you know, you being in St. Charles is a little further west than
Yep.
Carroll Stream, but I probably took the same routes and saw the
Yep.
same McDonald's
I used
on
to
the
shoot. I'm
way.
in Arlington Heights now, but I used to shoot down North Avenue every morning, man, and
North
it
Avenue
was
was how I went to when I was in my residency. We lived in Carroll Stream. I shot, we drove all, we kind of drove all the way to Oak Park, and it
yep.
was North Avenue along those in that area is more like a mini expressway. It moves pretty
And if you were
fast.
going to Oak Park, I had a teacher friend who was commuting from St. Charles to Oak Park
Oh,
to
wow.
work at the school, and he was saying he could tell you there's 72 stoplights between Oak Park
Wow.
and St. Charles. So you were doing it, man.
I was doing it, and you normalize that. So now let's think about normalizing. Let's think about this term normalizing, because
Mhm.
uh, a lot of the things that my wife, who is living with type 1 diabetes, has to deal with is normalizing some of the things that are fears, right? And I'm just curious, like, for a guy who's been through so much, you're still on this journey. What keeps you up at night?
As it pertains to myself, literally what keeps me up at night is user error. If I get a little too
Right.
crazy with what I'm eating and things like that. But we talked about that. But just in terms of emotionally, psychologically, my kids are approaching the age now where I was diagnosed, and
Mm.
that keeps me up. Now,
Ooh.
with that said, and again, I would love to hear your input on this, but science tells us that the percentages are in their favor, that they'll be fine and that they're not going to necessarily have a type 1 diagnosis. My wife is very metabolically healthy. All of the most of the diabetes, if not all, on her side was type 2 on her side of the family. And also just some changes. I
Yeah.
was, if you read if you go deep on some of the research about the endocrine system and autoimmune disorders like type 1 and things like that, nursing, breastfeeding has a huge I thought there was a large correlation, if I read right, about just building that immune system so that we
Oh,
have.
absolutely.
And so my wife, again, all credit goes to my wife in terms of just her patience with everything, just trying to do everything right and what is best for our family. So my kids were nursed. We held off on solid foods until the
Hmm.
recommended age. Whereas when I was a baby, I mean, it was the early 80s. It was, oh, let's get some rice cereal in that bottle, things like that. So, and I used to get respiratory illnesses all the time when I was a kid. And I'm
Right.
sure my immune system wasn't great because the food, I mean, our diets in the 90s were, hey, if you're thirsty, grab a Coke. Hey, why don't you grab some Snackwell's cookies, things like that. And I know that wasn't true for everybody, but it certainly was, enough, at least for us. And we just didn't know. So it keeps me up a little bit, but I'm also very hopeful that, hey, first of all, there's nothing we can do.
Hmm.
We can only do the healthiest choices, make the healthiest choices we can
That's right.
in that moment. And we've
That's
tried
right.
to do that with my kids the entire time that they've been on this planet. So, I'm hopeful that those things are, uh, that's enough of an offset to
That,
kind of,
yeah, to
to kind of
mitigate it.
negate, yeah, the genetics that I
Yeah.
bring to the table, and they're good. I mean, that's really about it. I'm, like anybody else, stress of life, everything we
That's
worry
right.
about, finances, family,
That's right.
parents, all that stuff. But in that vein, I think it's really important that after low carb, as I said, exposed kind of the weak links in the chain of my blood sugar every day, stress is a huge one.
Oh, yeah.
And, and so managing that stress is
Yeah.
something, and I know we'll talk about that when we get to the nest and the rope, but managing that stress is something that is huge, and being cognizant of that. And then when you're able to manage it, you don't stay up as much at night
That's
because,
right.
you
That's
just
right.
you kind of feel like you've at least controlled it as much as you can.
Yeah, you're gonna have stress, and managing it is the key, because it's gonna exist, and it's just life. And I even one of the things I learned in my functional medicine training is that your past matters. So, if I have a kid in front of me who has had a lot of ear infections and they had a lot of antibiotics, then their risk for autoimmune disease is going to be greater, because just all the exposures to, who knows what the antibiotics are doing to your
I
GI
was on
lining.
antibiotics twice a year, at least. I mean, it
Exactly, you know
was,
what I
yeah,
mean? I think
yeah.
all of that exposure, and we're doing what we think at the time is best for you, not realizing that too much of that can then affect the tight junctions in your gut, make those junctions open up a little bit, allow those larger proteins that shouldn't be absorbed into your system get into your system, and then when those proteins absorb, your body will say, "Huh, that looks like me, so I'm gonna get rid of that." But then, unfortunately, the side effect is that it started attacking itself. So it just kind of increases your risk for things like that. And
Yep.
that's just kind of what it is. But I just think that what we can do is control what we can. And I think, going back to your initial question about genetics, you have really good news in that it is actually the type 2s who have the stronger genetic risk.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really good news, uh, because you'll see families with type 2s and you'll see like everybody
Yep.
has it. But
Yep.
there's other factors, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that our type 2 is more of a environmental,
Yep.
cultural. So is it do they correct for that, right? When we look at research, do they correct for the fact that
Right.
everybody in the family eats the same way?
Right.
So is it really genetic or is it the lifestyle? So
Right. It's hard to separate that nature and nurture at that point, right? That
that's it.
environmental piece.
But
I'm
I
lucky.
think
My wife was a D1 swimmer when she was younger, and she had a great coach who, in the mid '90s, said, "You can work out all you want, you can practice, you can do all that. Get rid of the soda, get rid of the sugar. I don't know, but it just doesn't seem like it's very good for you." And this was in the early to mid '90s. And my wife hasn't, she's been living basically this way for decades. And it's
oh
funny because
wow,
she's like, "Oh, Mike, I've been telling you forever, maybe you should get rid of some of the sugar." But then it takes some people on the internet to tell you that you should get
that's
rid of
right.
it. And she's going, "Where's my credit?" So
That's right.
all credit to her, because that's the other reason that it's easier. I have that support system at home. I'm not fighting it against my own family. And then on top of that, my kids, when I was young, again, late '80s, if you were thirsty, you reached for juice or soda. And
That's
now
right.
my kids will ask for water. And I know that seems like a really simple, silly thing, but like, just, it's all of those little things that I'm hoping add up to keep us healthy as we go forward into adulthood and old age, for my kids and for my wife and I.
So I asked you about your kids' names, but what about your wife?
Christina.
Now, just want to do a shout out to Christina, and I'll even do a shout out to my wife, Karan.
Sure.
Man, I tell you, they have this like thing they say, well, behind every good man, right? But I'm
Oh,
gonna tell you something. That's probably true, guys. Oh my
100%.
God, uh,
Yep.
I don't know what God made women out of, but it's some good stuff. And and you think about the theme of this podcast, protecting your nest. Well, much better than even I do, my wife protects the nest.
Yep.
And it's almost like a vulture. It's like, don't mess with what's in that nest. And
Correct.
so I really appreciate what they bring to the table. And we do want to give her credit for what she's done. So if you haven't said it enough to her, let her know Dr. Hampton.
I absolutely will.
Kudos.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Dr. Hampton, he's got the advice on low carb on the internet, but don't worry, he's got you too.
That's right. I got her back. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the team. So you have other people on your team besides me. Of course, we always have endocrinologists involved when we have people with type 1 diabetes, and um, and I just want to talk a little bit about what's been your experience with statins. We know that's always controversial,
Yep.
and and I think it's important to understand that the standard of care, guys, is that if you have diabetes, most doctors are recommending you be on the statin.
Yep.
And so they're doing what they're supposed to do in terms of that. They may not see the world through the lens we have, but how have you dealt with that conversation around those cholesterol medicines?
So in my 20s, I took them because my doctor said, "Hey, we're seeing heart disease still happen, and we're lowering the threshold for total cholesterol to put you on statins, and we're not seeing an improvement." Now, at the
That's right.
time, had I been in the universe of low carb, I would have said, "Well, then maybe it's not. Maybe it's something else. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place, and
Right,
it's the
right, right.
sugar and not the." But so I took them and tolerated them okay.
Hmm.
Some side effects here and there. And then just out of pure, like, I stopped taking them out of, I hadn't, it's not because I went low carb for probably 5, 6 years. I just didn't take them because life got in the way. And it was,
That's
I
right.
was neglecting my health. And that's how I gained all the weight. And not taking doctors' advice very, very strongly. And then when I started with low carb and I was in that community and in that online world, learning about cholesterol and statins and
Hmm.
you know particle breakdowns and all of that stuff, and what cholesterol does for your brain, and Georgia Eads' book, again, just eye-opening for me. The title of that is "Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind," if
Yeah,
anyone's interested.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But and I know you did an episode on it, but yeah, no. So now, so when I first started low carb, my previous primary care practitioner, who was a wonderful guy, said, "No, you need to be taking these." And I said, "Okay." And
Hmm.
I just never filled the prescription. And I
Mm.
went back after, because initially my cholesterol shot up significantly when I started low carb, high fat. But
Hmm.
it kind of leveled out. It came back down. But I was, my triglycerides hover around 35, 36. All of my particles
Amazing.
are in line. My HDL was 85, something like that. So it's all good. But if you're only going on that HDL, LDL, then I don't blame him. I mean, he's telling me what
That's
he
right.
was told to tell me. And so
That's right.
but I was, and again, this is where my wife's like, would you just tell the guy that you're not taking this? Because I went in the office and he said, look, the statins are working. And I was like, okay. But in my head, I'm going,
Right.
I never took them. It's actually,
That's
and
right.
she's like, tell him so that when the next guy comes in, he might
That's
consider this. And
right.
she was
That's right.
absolutely right. But I
Yeah.
just wasn't in that place yet with,
That's
this
right.
is where I was still worried about eating a lot of fat. But now it's funny that evolution is happening because I went
Hmm.
and saw my endocrinologist a couple of weeks ago. And she's great. And she said, based on your total cholesterol, I should recommend a statin for you.
That's right.
If you want one, I'll give you one. However, uh, and that usually would be the end of the discussion where I would be recommended to put on it. But you had written an order for the CAC score and taking a look at all of these other data points
That's
that we
right.
now have.
That's right.
And functional, I mean, if we want to look at my heart, we did that. And
Hmm.
my CAC score was 0.
That's
And
right.
so the doctor, for the first time in 27 years of being diabetic, my endocrinologist said, everything in the book says I should put you on a statin, but I can't justify giving it to you or making you take it if these are your other numbers. And it sounds like your primary care provider has a handle on it. And I didn't have that tool. I didn't have you. I didn't have that tool in my toolbox prior to this. So, the more that this message can spread and just at least make it an option for some people is really where the importance of this is.
Shocking.
Yeah, I know. And I was kind
And
of
I'm so
laughing. And
excited.
she said, she's like, I get it. I know. I get it. Like she
I
knew. I mean,
love.
there are certain things that she has to, for standard of care. And I get it. I'm a
Yeah.
teacher. There are certain things we have to say and
That's
recommend,
right.
and certain
That's
things we
right.
can't say and recommend. And that's fine. But that's just why more of this information out there so that we can. I love doctors. They've saved me.
Oh my goodness. That's
And I
right.
love medicine and I love science and technology. But at the same time, it is really great to also learn from those other minds that are scientific minds. Dr. Sean Baker, you, all the people doing cholesterol work, and just kind of boil it down for yourself and see
That's right.
where you think it fits. So, but I really am enjoying having a medical team that is, I feel like, on board.
Yeah.
Not because I want confirmation bias, but rather just
Right.
because I feel like we're all working together to get
It's
the bike going in the same
That's
direction.
right.
You
And I
know,
think it's okay for a clinician who is even plant-based. If you see outcomes that make you feel more comfortable, then honor the outcomes, and I'm going to walk with you. I have my preference. I have guidelines that they want me to follow, but man, hearing that your endocrinologist said, you know what, it looks like your numbers are, you have a 0 calcium score, your other metrics are looking favorable. I can't, with my good conscience,
yeah,
recommend something that's not making sense. And until the American Heart Association's recommendation, and I did a great video with the Black Carnivore. Uh, A-Day Fox, and we talked about when they announced that they endorsed low carb and keto. They also said in that same document, and you can go back and look at that YouTube video, that the person with a 0 calcium score, even with diabetes, does not need to be on the statin. But most doctors do not know that. And if I were the endocrinologist who, in good conscience, didn't want to put you on a statin, that's what I would put in your note and say, based on the recommendation. Now, it may not be the standard of care for the health system. It may not be the standard of care for the American Diabetes Association. But if we get one organization that's saying this, and we are talking about heart disease here,
yeah.
prevention, then if it's coming from them, we should feel better. So I think for those who have not heard that, please check out that position statement that they put out, I think in 23. It was fairly recent. So
Yep.
man, thank you for sharing that. And I do want to touch on another thing briefly, which is we kind of talked mainly about diabetes, but and you touched on migraines earlier.
Yep.
Let's dive into just a couple of. Let's talk about some of the other health conditions that you benefited from. Maybe starting with the migraines.
Yeah. So it's funny. I had so the last migraine I had was November. I would normally
Hmm.
get them 2-3 times a month. Um, Being better with carbohydrate consumption had improved them, but they still weren't going away. And then I just started taking a fish oil, an omega-3 supplement that I
Yep.
get from Pure Vitamin Club.
Yep.
And I just like those because there's not a bunch of extra stuff in them, and they
That's
add
right.
chlorophyll, so I don't get the fish burps and all that. That's all.
That's cool.
I'm not working
Is
for
that
them. But
Vinny's
that is
product?
Vinny's company. Yep,
Okay,
yep,
cool.
yep.
Okay, cool. Okay.
And so I started taking that 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening. I think they're 1,250 milligrams each, and it was within your guidelines on some information and literature you had given me about EPA and DHA and things like that. I went from November until this past Wednesday without a migraine, which is unheard of for me. And again, I will get migraines in the future. That's okay. But if
Mm-hmm.
I can get them, just like with diabetes, if I can minimize so that it's a nuisance and not a debilitating issue, that's great. And I got one on Wednesday, and it was user error. I hadn't been sleeping. We had a lot of stress, just things going off. I was, dropping my son off at camp, and there were logistics,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't putting in the time it takes to work on myself, to sleep, to eat right, and to
Mm-hmm.
exercise. And boom, there they come. And
Yeah.
and that's okay. But yeah, that's been super helpful. I found that omega-3s have been huge for that, I think. But in addition to migraines, I think anxiety. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid in the early '90s, and there wasn't a whole lot to do with it. I tried, as into adulthood, I tried the medications for it. I tried Ritalin, I tried Adderall, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I found that those worked great for about 10 hours. And then my
Mm-hmm.
family could not be around me because when I would crash, man, and I
Oh,
know that I should
yeah.
have just probably fine tuned and things like that, but it just didn't seem like a long term solution for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I can tell you. So again, my low carb journey began because of diabetes and weight loss. As I've fine tuned it and started working with you, and I've looked into living day to day in deep dietary ketosis, where my
Mm-hmm.
ketone millimoles are between 1.0 and 3.0 when I test, those symptoms go away. I also have a movement disorder. I have Tourette syndrome that I was diagnosed with when I was a child. And those
Mm.
tics, all 99%, they just go away.
That's crazy.
And I don't, again, correlation versus causation, I know,
Right. That's
but
right.
I also know that, and again, here's where you can correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the drugs they'll prescribe for Tourette syndrome are related to epilepsy drugs. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Correct.
And so what I'm assuming is that if the Charlie Foundation tells us anything, and if epilepsy is so greatly impacted by living in dietary ketosis, I have to think that whatever part of the brain is causing my movement disorders might be positively affected by my diet. And so,
That's right.
it's definitely, again, it's a vanity thing, but it's also, as I get older, different movements and repeated movements, like my joints can hurt and things like that, and I don't want that. Um, so that's really helpful. I'm trying to think of what else.
That's that's some good stuff.
Yeah, it's
I
really
mean,
it's really good.
you didn't sign up for all this improvement, but it just
No,
kind of
it just
came
I know
along for
I'll
the
take
ride.
them. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Where
Yeah.
where but yeah, it's the upshot of all of this is that when every little one of these things in kind of the things within your basket of control, the things that you can control, when they improve, I'm a better dad, I'm a better partner to my wife, I'm a better family member, and
That's right.
and that's all
Ooh.
really important. But I think the part that is important not to overlook too is when you feel better about yourself, that's why all those things get better. It's not just because you're about I'm a better, I happen to think I'm a wonderful husband, but
Right,
that's
right.
not my wife might not always agree, but when I'm feeling good about myself, that's when I'm at my best for people in my house, and then for my students at work, and everybody. So
Yeah, I love it. Again, I mentioned in a previous episode that I'll be one of the speakers at the Symposium for Metabolic Health. I'll talk about all the wonderful things that keto can fix. And there are some things that the one thing that has level one evidence, meaning it's not just randomized controlled trials, but it's the meta analysis of the randomized controlled trials level of evidence, which is the
yep,
highest quality research we have. Epilepsy is right there with
yep,
over 100 years. I mean, we're talking about 1921 was when they started using ketosis as the approach. And when I spoke at the Keto Orlando Summit, literally, a few days ago from this recording, um, I talked about who should be in ketosis for sure, and who
Hmm.
should consider just being low carb,
Hmm.
therapeutic carb restriction. Any of the neurological conditions, and I'm sure Dr. Georgia E would agree, are the kind of conditions where you want to be in ketosis ideally. And you could easily argue ADHD is in that category,
Yeah.
which you may or may not had. You
Yep.
could easily argue migraines are in that category. You could easily argue Tourette's are in that category. So I think for neurological conditions, no brainer.
Yep.
Things like epilepsy. For mental health, we talked about anxiety.
Yep.
It's probably a good idea to think about that for mental health conditions, rather, and particularly not just anxiety, depression. I'm talking about if you got bipolar, like Amber O'Hearn, who's a great follow on Twitter, who's
Yeah.
brilliant. She is doing so well with bipolar that she doesn't even take medicines.
Sorry, my dog
And
just walked in the room.
oh no,
That's
that's okay.
awesome.
Yeah, what's your dog's name?
Stella, but she's
Okay, Stella.
Greyhound.
I
Yeah.
love that name. Stella trying to get her groove back. So we're good. So I guess, honestly, guys, I mean, this is just so hopeful to know that for some people you're getting improvement in areas that you didn't expect. For people who are hearing this and like, oh, I got Tourette's, I got migraines, I got issues around ADHD. Well, guess what? The drugs don't work too good for these things. They work okay, but now you have a way to mitigate that. So let
There's
me
a great video that Sean Baker did with a Tourette's patient who basically
really.
functionally cured. Yeah, I don't know her name. I can't recall it, but if you
Okay.
just Google Sean Baker Tourette syndrome, you'll
Okay,
find the
we'll
video on
find it.
YouTube.
I'll look that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thanks for sharing that resource. So let's kind of wrap up with a couple of brief questions. So money is not a factor, and what would you do if you had all the money in the world? How would you spend your time?
I would I would write. I'm a middle school teacher, and there is a lot of really good young adult literature out there, but I don't think there's enough of it. And I would love to just write creative fiction. And
Nice.
I've dabbled in that a little bit for those guys. And then
Okay.
also one of the things my wife talks about all the time is, and what you touched on is, I wish there was some sort of resource out there for newly diagnosed diabetics,
Yes.
particularly
Yes.
ones who are teenagers. Um,
Yes.
for type ones, that to get like almost not an onboarding service, but but a, just a mentor program. I'm not sure what it would look like, but and I don't know legally speaking what that would look like if you had, for certifications with doctors and nutritionists and things like that. But just having a service or a resource available to someone where they could come in and say, this new shocking thing has happened. We're dealing with the day to day of it, but how do we, where do we go from here, and what resources are out there so that they're not spending 20 years looking for the resources before they can implement them. The resources are right there. And that, that sort of has been conglomerated for you already and aggregated for you already. So I don't know what that would look like, a sort of a beginning life coach for a type 1
Hmm.
diabetic, but I would love to explore all, with no financial responsibilities. I would love to
That's right.
explore being able to put something together. And there are online resources that are out there, but much like a nutritionist might offer their services, somebody who kind of is able to recommend those different resources
Yeah,
and is
I like
open to
that.
low carb, because it takes people have to find this on their own, to be quite honest, in terms
I
of
know.
most endocrinology right now.
And speaking to our kids, I just had Michelle Hearn on, and she wrote this great book about you know just metabolic health, and it's directed at our babies.
Yeah.
I had a previous guest who her name is Dr. Jasmine Cersei Pate. She wrote a book called Olivia Takes a Mental Health Day. And it's really about making sure our babies, as they deal with, they have stress too, guys, and we want to make sure that they also are given the permission to focus on their brain and their mind. So I've really enjoyed. I'm so happy and grateful that you, although your dog is like, listen, we got some things to do, but I appreciate you taking the time
Of course.
to spend really 2 hours with me. The first hour, part one, now part two, and I really the richness of what I was hoping to come out of part two has occurred. So I really appreciate that. as we're kind of wrapping up, of course, we want to make sure we keep you around so you can teach, be a great husband, a great father, and of course, a great patient for me.
Likewise.
How do you plan to protect your nest over the next 12 months?
So I think just running through it quickly, with nutrition, we talked about it, just continuing to fine tune the end there, to fine tune what I'm eating and get it even better. And again, that's the power to me of low carb, is that it has given me an outlook on everything I'm doing as it pertains to my health, and then other things, career endeavors, things like that. That it's always possible to get back to improve. So just continuing to improve what I'm eating, looking at ketovore and carnivore, things like that. For the E, for exercise, zone 2 exercise changed my life. This was the one other thing that I felt like was a secret. I used to if you ask any type 1 diabetic, the hardest part about exercise is they say exercise to keep your blood sugar in control. Great. I'm going to go all out on a run. I'm going to spike my heart rate. Nobody ever told me. And what would happen is that heart rate would spike, right? And then I would either, one of two things would happen. I would go low or I would go high. And what I didn't know, and again, the physiology of it is that your body goes, oh my God, your body doesn't know it's 2024. Your body goes, I'm getting chased by a saber-toothed cat. So all hands on deck. We're pumping out a bunch of sugar or we're burning sugar, and it would kick off that roller coaster. So you would exercise to stay healthy. It would kick off a roller coaster. You would consume hundreds of sugar calories of juice boxes and all that stuff, right? Then I started with Vinny on his recommendation of zone 2, keeping my heart rate 180 minus my age, keep it there. I can ride a bicycle now fasted. I can exercise fasted for 3-4 hours. I'll do 100-kilometer bike rides completely fasted, and my blood sugar doesn't move. And it's because maintaining, controlling that heart rate. So that's my goal for exercise, is to continue to do that in these next 12 months. I've done 100K. I'm shooting for 100-miler, an imperial century, as they call it in the cycling world. And just some more weightlifting, just feeling good about how I feel, and things like that. Stress and sleep, those are things that, now that my diet, I feel like, is working for the most part, most days, it exposes that stress is a blood sugar liability, and just controlling that stress and doing the best I can to reduce it. One of my favorite mantras that I've heard in the last month or so is, let the world solve that problem for you. So you might run up at work or in your family, you'll run into a problem. And it's many of us want to just try to control it right away and fix it. And there are some problems where, you've got to let the world solve that, because it will. If you're just patient, that will solve itself. And I'm trying to just be mindful of that and keep that going. I've heard it also said, you got to let that go. That's the other one. That's the other simple way of saying it. Thinking and trauma, ketosis, man. I keep staying in that 1 to 3 range. I can handle whatever comes at me so much more easily when I feel like my brain is running clean. And that's, for me, that's deep dietary ketosis. So just continuing that.
That's right.
Dr. Georgia Eads' book, as I said, was huge here for me in validating how I felt about it, and making it accessible for the average person who's not a doctor. Relationships, after 17 years of marriage, just remembering how lucky I am, and that I have this support network that people would kill for. Because I think the day-to-day, it's so easy with family and kids and extended family and parents and all this stuff. It's easy to forget that. And sometimes you got to take a look around. And unfortunately, it's when a traumatic experience happens that it forces us to realize that. But trying to not have to get to that bottom before you realize that, hey, man, I'm really, really lucky.
That's right.
And that's, just doing your best with the experience that you have. And this is one thing I've actually enjoyed about aging, is I feel like I have experience that is an asset, and letting people come to that. If you just do things with integrity,
that's right.
People will find you, and it will work out. Avoiding the good and the bad with the O for organism, for rope.
I know.
Looking into better food consistently. The one thing I want to look at now is, because, especially with looking at more carnivore, living in Illinois, I don't love the winters, but we do have a lot of farms around us. And I would love to start exploring more sustainably, for environmental reasons, but also for health reasons, sustainably farmed beef and pork and things like that.
That's right.
That, a lot of those kind of collar counties around where we live have a lot of there's a big movement right now with farmers that are doing a lot more close to home, farm to table stuff. So I want to look at that. Right. And that leads into the P, which is pollutants. Been recently doing a lot of reading about plastics and endocrine interrupters. and what's in the grass that is being fed to our animals that we're consuming. And um, I if that's a fine-tuning area, especially for my
Mhm.
kids, and especially
Yeah.
my endocrine system already does weird things, right? And my so with diabetes, so trying to eliminate some of that stuff from just from my diet and from my daily life.
That's right.
And then
That's right.
finally, that E, that's so important, the emotions and life experiences. It's just the little things, man. Slow it down. And I think now entering my 40s, that has reminded me, like, this is a ride, and you got to enjoy it. And I know that sounds so cliche, but I took my son to camp last week up in Michigan, and I dropped him off, and I just spent a few days. I was able to spend a few days camping nearby, and I would see him in the evenings when we would do
Mhm.
like campfires and stuff with his camp. But I got to sit in a tent and read a book, or walk on the beach on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. It was just, you realize this other stuff doesn't matter. I mean, all the
It
things that seem to be super stressful, it's not a huge deal. Going for coffee with my wife, just little things, exercising with my kids, realizing that's the other thing low carb has done. It's let me realize that that time is not over for me.
right.
I lived for 10 years in my 30s where it was like, oh, I'm just the dad who can't keep up with his kids now.
Mhm.
And you realize my son is a cross country athlete. He'll take me for runs. He's still kicking my butt, but listen, he's got 14-year-old legs. That's why. But
That's right.
but it makes you realize, like, oh, this is part of my life.
That's
My
right.
daughter is just a beast. She's a hurdler, and she's a swimmer and a gymnast, and it's inspiring to be able to do the best that I can and not see a huge functional difference. As much as I joke about it, at 42 versus 22, I'm probably in
Mhm.
better shape now than I was back then, just because of healthy living choices.
That's
And
right.
that to me is that emotional and life experience part that's so powerful.
Wow.
Yeah.
And yes, Benjamin Button is a thing. We can reverse the
And
aging.
that's where it's hard not to shout about this to everybody, because it's like, no, 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 no. It's the best, and I know we're running out of time here, but the best way I was listening on NPR to Hidden Brain, or one of those programs about studying what does it actually mean to age. And they were saying many people will attribute, my left knee hurts. I did it. My left knee hurts because I'm getting
Mhm.
old. Well, your right knee is just as old as your left knee, and your
Right.
right knee is fine. So there must be some answer that we can at least try to pursue.
Ooh-wee.
And this diet has given me a way
Ooh-wee.
to do that.
You're preaching to the choir. I actually, was, again, preparing for the Chicago Marathon. I never did it, but I got to 15 miles, but as I was training, I had problems with my left knee, and I fixed it by the muscle on the left quad was weak.
Yep.
So,
Going through the
like you
same thing
said,
right now.
see what I'm saying? So it's like, oh, so
Yep.
I strengthened my left quad. At that
Not
time, I
actually
was
your knee. It's yep, yep, yep.
yeah,
And when
something.
you
There's
talk, and
always a
that's the other
reason.
thing. You talk to a physical therapist, and it's like magic. And I'd be like, "How do you know
Huh,
that?" And they would
but
go, "Well, believe it or not, a lot of people deal with this."
but
So,
guess what? But not only that, I love my colleagues.
yep,
We've talked about endocrine and other people on the team, but man, I feel like I didn't go to medical school when I talked to a physical therapist. Like
yeah,
they can start naming muscles. I forgot it. I learned those muscles to pass the test.
yep.
They know what they are, what they do, and if I fix this and get things lined up, just like a good chiropractor. So it's a team, guys,
It
and
is.
that
It can
and
always
we're
be better. That's the upshot. It can always be
always,
better.
always be better. And I just appreciate everybody who checked out this episode because now we're on their team. We're giving them food for thought. And I do want to do a shout out. You've mentioned Vinny many times, and I want to say two things about Vinny. Number one, he was he was the first person who kind of embraced me in the low carb community. I was on his show a couple of times, but I just felt like he was the embracer. Now he's been doing this way longer than me, but Vinny and no, avoiding the sugars and grains, his model and his dedication to his community is so important. And because of that, I literally got a email yesterday, and I'm sure people who follow him get the email, and they just released the Dirty Keto book or documentary.
Yep. It's on
So
Amazon.
it's on Amazon. So I'm looking at it right now. You can rent it for $2.99 and you can buy it for $9.99. And I'm also going to thank him for allowing me to be on, uh, Beyond Impossible documentary, which I had a chance to share a few of my thoughts. So shout out to Vinny, shout out to you, your wife, the kids, and for giving me over 2 hours of your time. I hope my audience appreciates the
It's my
content we
pleasure. I hope I didn't
discussed.
bore them to death, but
No,
yeah.
you didn't, man. There are always those who will benefit from a voice that will either provide perspective they hadn't heard, or, oh, he's just like me. If he can do it, I can do it. So thank you so much, man, for coming to this episode, part 2 of our recording of the Protecting Your Nest podcast. Mike, thank you so much. And
Of course, thank you.
Thank you so much, my brother. And you know what, guys? If you want to be like Mike, and I can say that because we're in the Chicagoland area.
You're up here in the 90s, man. It's who are the Bulls beating this year? It's not
That's
if.
right. Exactly. So
Yep.
we're Michael Jordan fans all the way. I don't care about who you call the GOAT. We consider Michael the GOAT. And
I don't care who you call the GOAT. You're wrong. It's Michael Jordan.
Right. Exactly. And but I really appreciate that. But I also appreciate you wanting to be like Mike, because today the theme was about restoring hope to anyone who suffers from diabetes, but particularly those who have to take insulin, because a lot of the folk, type 1s especially, they feel like they're second-class citizens. So imagine living in a world where everyone with type 1 diabetes can celebrate those normal A1C levels, like the type 1 grit group, that study that I'm going to have a link in this. Imagine all the type 2s who are on insulin getting off insulin. I had a previous guest, Gwendolyn Butler, who got off insulin after 11 years by simply reducing her carbs in 45 days. It's unbelievable. So it may seem a far-fetched dream, but we have examples like Gwendolyn. We have the example like Mike, who has shown us it's possible. And we also have research like the study I'm going to share, that if you reduce the macronutrient, the one that causes the harm, the poison, you will be able to better control your blood sugar. So controlling your carb intake will help you regulate your blood sugars in a way that will allow you to have normal A1Cs. And it's really a powerful tool, if not the most powerful tool, to help you do that. So as we continue our journey towards restoring hope and improving the lives of individuals with diabetes, let us remember the impact that a healthy diet can have on achieving that vision. You can't do it with medicine alone. And for those who don't have type 1, you can do it only with diet. And for type 2s and for type 1s, you can do it by simply doing both medicine and diet together, guys, through this education, supporting each other like Mike's family's doing for him, and just dedication and to eating well. We can have a future where everyone affected by diabetes can actually have a normal lifespan. So I just want to continue to spread this message. If you know anybody that needs to hear this message, share this podcast, share the YouTube video. And I just want to thank you and everybody for checking out this episode. So until we meet again with another great guest like Mike, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest.